Fans of survival horror didn't have a lot of modern choices in the previous gaming generation. Resident Evil 4 had come and gone a few years earlier, and outside of a handful of mostly unremarkable underground experiences available here and there, which mostly were limited to PC, it was slim pickings for us horror fans before Amnesia came out and revived the genre and elevated it to the glorious relevance that we find it at today. But there was one game developer that saw that void and wanted to fill it with something special. So in 2008, Dead Space blasted and dismembered its way onto the PlayStation 3, the Xbox 360, and PC via Visceral Games. And visceral it was. Dead Space featured a mix of gore, very disturbing imagery, and just enough defenselessness to keep players scrambling for ammo, which was always just plentiful enough to barely get you through the next encounter. Since Resident Evil 4 was the last great horror game in most gamers' minds, Dead Space followed suit with that over-the-shoulder presentation that made aiming easy and fun, but kept players close to the action to feel similar to a first-person game. What made Dead Space an improvement over recent horror action games, though, was that the main character, Isaac, wasn't a cop or a soldier of any kind. He was essentially just a futuristic blue-collar worker who had just ended up at the absolutely worst place at the absolute worst possible time, and had to fight his way out. Dead Space featured a relatively unique monster species that perfectly justified a wild assortment of variations and situations. The game also increased immersion by displaying stats on or around Isaac within the world, eliminating the need for much of a HUD at all. Dead Space never tried to be pure horror, though. It definitely straddled the line between horror and action, as many survival games do, but it did lean heavily in the horror direction, contrasting itself with most similar games at the time. This was a delightful and horrific breath of fresh air for fans of the genre, and Dead Space was greeted with great reviews and respectable sales. Much like the notorious necromorphs, the Dead Space series kept coming back with a second and third installment, and even a couple of side stories with books, movies, and smaller games that were all generally received well, with only some dissent emerging from fans about the third game losing sight of what made the original so special. So why, after the series gained so much momentum in such a short period of time, did Dead Space completely fall off the map? What the hell happened to Dead Space? Well, part of the answer to this is probably embedded in that criticism of the third game that I just mentioned. Dead Space was an overall solid series that did sell and review well pretty much across the board, but much like a lot of horror franchises, the perfectly balanced horror to action ratio did see a slight gradual slide toward action through the main trilogy. In Dead Space 2, it was barely even noticeable, as the mechanics and gameplay from the first game were almost entirely untouched, outside of Isaac controlling a little snappier and ammo being made a little more plentiful. Isaac was more of a character in Dead Space 2 as well, and actually had dialogue, which some players liked as it did make him easier to care about, but other players disliked it as it demystified the tone of the game and divided focus away from the atmosphere. Either way, these changes, while subtle, did make Dead Space 2 feel a little more like a typical sequel than a return to the strange, cryptic experience of the original. Plus, it didn't help that the half-baked online mode reeked of Electronic Arts' meddling, and while it sort of was fun for a short while, it lost its appeal quickly for most and largely felt unnecessary. Dead Space 2 did add some nice variety in a lot of ways, but it did come at the cost of some of the original's enigmatic charm. While not preferable to a lot of fans of the original, this was ultimately an acceptable trade-off for most until Dead Space 3. Ultimately, Dead Space 3 just continued on the trajectory that Dead Space 2 put the series on, with more action elements and tightening of the gameplay, but the fact that there would now be human enemies, which meant a cover system and straight-up gun battles, was just too much for some, and since it was part of the marketing to mention this, the lead-up to 3 was riddled with complaints from disheartened fans who felt that the identity of Dead Space was all but completely blown out the airlock, and they weren't entirely wrong about that. Yes, Dead Space 3 looked like Dead Space, it sounded like Dead Space, and at times it felt like Dead Space, but it just wasn't Dead Space any longer. Scavenger bots that would bring you resources despite resources being more prolific than ever subtracted most of the scarcity and frantic scavenging element, and weapon crafting allowing you to arm Isaac to the teeth subtracted from the struggle to compensate for certain weapons' shortcomings. So essentially what you were left with was a great action game that was set in the Dead Space universe. Dead Space 3 did succeed with an interesting online co-op mode that featured another character, Carver, whose story was, in my opinion, far more interesting than Isaac's was at that point, and it's a shame that it couldn't have been experienced by more players. The interesting extra story wasn't enough though, and all of these elements just added on to the pile of reasons for fans of the original game to feel like the series had lost its way. The game didn't sell or review horribly, and it wasn't a bad game per se, but it was and is widely regarded as the worst of the main series. And perhaps it made sense to put the series on ice for a little while after that. Unfortunately, during that while, we saw a series of issues arise from Visceral Games. Their work on Battlefield Hardline was not well received, and probably served as the proverbial Strike 2 in the eyes of EA, and it was objectively a pretty boring, uninspired game that most self-respecting Battlefield fans have forgotten about by now. Not too long after that, rumors of a linear, story-focused Star Wars game lit up many Visceral and Star Wars fans alike, but that also ran into trouble. This unfortunately led to the end of Visceral Games, and even though EA still owns the Dead Space IP, now that the team is fragmented and the studio is technically gone, the likelihood of another Dead Space game is lower than it has ever been, and with each passing year, it just seems to get lower. That is more or less what happened to Dead Space. A very unfortunate outcome for all, as I'm sure many of the original team would love to have another crack at the franchise, perhaps to bring it back to its roots, and it would probably sell well, pleasing EA, and fans largely still have love for the franchise and would probably take a chance on a fourth installment. However, the fact that no hints or clues whatsoever have emerged in all of this time, and we haven't even gotten word of as much as a remastered collection, it's looking like, as of now, if you want to dismember some necromorphs aboard the Ishimura ever again, you're going to need to fire up some older hardware.
And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.